This is Chuck Rowe from Midwest Studies Group. Thanks again for joining us for yet another edition to our video series. With things starting to open up again, we're starting to see willingness for nonprofits to do capital campaigns. That's why we're doing a two-part series in regards to capital campaigns for first-timers. This week in particular is we're going to talk about where to start from a building perspective. So joining me today is one of the partners from INVISION Architects, Eric Ritland, and president of Cardinal Construction, Katy Susong.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck.
Well, we've all seen this before. A nonprofit has a friend that, is a contractor or something and says, hey, I want to build a building. Can you help? Let's start out with the basics. First off, does it matter if they start with an architect or a contractor in a perfect world?
Well, I think Eric and I are going to have a different response to this one, Chuck.
Well, let's hear it.
Oh, no, you know what, in my opinion, honestly, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of difference who they necessarily start with. I think what's probably more important is getting the right team members on board early and ideally close to the same time, because I think you can start by getting everybody working from the same set of expectations, working towards the same goals. Earlier in the process, I always think that leads to a better end result. Architects bring their particular skill set to a project, and contractors bring a different skill set. And I think together they pair really well. So I think what's really crucial is getting together a good team early on in the process.
Yep, I would agree with that. And a good team that understands the right questions to ask and help evaluate options is really key. So yeah. You want somebody that's going to have the client and the owner's best interest in mind and really help them, think through all the possibilities.
So is it normal for, let's say you go to the architect first or the contractor, either or, is it normal for the client to then find the other person to the team, or does the architect help, suggest a few contractors and vice versa? What do you usually see?
I would say vice versa, and I would support what Katy said earlier, that it's good to get the whole team together as soon as practical. Some clients prefer, and if they're public, are required to go through a public bidding process. If you're able to avoid that and get a team together that can really help deliver the best value, that's really key.
I agree fully with what Eric says, and I think we've been on both sides of that coin where we've been asked to kind of help with the selection of the architect, and in probably more cases the architect has already been selected and is part of bringing a contractor on. I think kind of the critical piece with the owner is if there's a relationship there, certainly that's good information to have, but being in this industry, both the architect and the contractor are going to have people that they work with, that they're familiar with. They might have particular skill in the type of building that they're looking at. So there's value, again, that can come from having that right partner in place.
Well, when you think of the projects that have been more successful that you both have worked with before, what sort of things do those organizations tend to have in place even before coming to meet with either of you?
I would say kind of a thoughtful master plan, a vision of the future. Having everything doesn't mean having everything today. So, a lot of times budget, there's constraints. Fundraising can be a challenge sometimes. So having a vision for the future that you can work toward allows sometimes things to happen in a logical, in a more effective way faster. Mm-hmm. So that's one example.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, if there's a particular project that you're looking at, having a clear set of kind of goals for what the project is going to accomplish, what need is going to be met for a given organization. I think setting the table with, really having some clear thought put into that is important before you engage that architect and contractor. I mean, our role is really to, like Eric said earlier, to ask the questions, to dig deeper and understand really, what the needs are and be able to develop a product out of that. But to start with a good, clear set of guidelines for a project is super helpful.
Well, based on both of your experiences, and when it comes to knowing this information before a project comes into play, you probably have heard this phrase before. We have the perfect place because someone's giving us some land. You may have heard that once or twice in your career. What suggestions would you have for organizations when you hear that phrase?
Well, that could be a great thing. I mean, it's some things, locations, some are sensitive, some are less sensitive to location. So we would help them evaluate the site, and if it's a bad location, we can help them look at options. There might be some value, maybe do a trade or a sale or a swap. But free land is a great thing. But we could do it. We could easily do a quick test fit, make sure it's going to fit, especially long term, and meet their needs and be in the right location to serve their audience or their customers that they are serving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all really important points, no doubt. From the contractor's perspective, I think we come in and say, that's fantastic. Let's take a minute and look at what this land really is. Was this a laundromat in the past? Was this, something where we may have to worry about what's underground here? So I think, yeah, absolutely. Free land is exciting. To know that that's not something that you're going to have to account for as a cost in your building project is great, but definitely need to consider what that site really is, and if there really is value in that free site, or maybe it makes sense to look elsewhere where you have to pay a little bit, but you're going to be better off in the long run.
Yeah,
Well,
there's a big difference between a greenfield site that maybe was a cornfield versus a brownfield site, which is former industrial area.
Yeah.
Substantial difference, and just to get it ready to build, the brownfield or the former industrial sites is going to be very costly. It might cost more than just remedying the site. It costs more than the building project itself.
Well, another factor for organizations when it comes to land is, and I think every executive director that's ever been through a capital campaign has done this before. I may or may not have been guilty of this, but you find out how big of a piece of land this is, and you say, oh, great, I could actually build a building this big. But then it turns out there's other things you need to keep in mind on that plot of land as well. What are some things that people should be considering that should also be on that land that will take up some of that space?
Well, the first thing is zoning, making sure that what you want to build is going to work within the zone of this that the city has. You can go through variances and get things adjusted, but making sure there's not going to be the NIMBY, not in my backyard of the neighbors, a situation like that. So that's probably the first thing I would look at. But doing test fitting, there's going to be requirements like green space, parking counts per, usually a factor of square footage of the building. Just making sure, and stormwater detention, making sure all those big rocks on the site are going to fit and going to fit long term.
And to kind of pile on top of that a little bit more then is, besides just land costs and ways to use the land, what about other costs when it comes to building that people don't even think about? Because they'll hear like let's say a lot of times people hear like a per square foot average, and they'll just say, well, I want this many feet, so I guess it's going to cost this much. But then there's other factors they're not thinking about when it comes to building. What are some things that you notice that people often don't even think about when it comes to a project?
Well, we oftentimes help clients, and usually do this, that we help them put together what we call an overall project budget versus just the construction cost. And so the overall project budget includes construction costs, which Katy helps with. And also we factor in furniture, fixtures, equipment. Early on, that's usually just a percentage. And there's also soft costs, architecture, engineering, soil boring, site surveys, things like that. And within the project budget as well, we also include a contingency, especially early on, to help buffer some decisions and allow some flexibility, especially if there's a board of directors or somebody that needs to approve the project budget. It offers a little buffer or some flexibility within the budget to make a few tweaks and changes during the design.
I think another consideration along those lines too is taking a look at, potentially what that project schedule is going to look like. Depending on when you break ground, a consideration might be winter conditions. If you're going to want to continue building through the colder months of the year, that certainly adds cost to the project. So it's something that, might not necessarily be an upfront consideration, but something that is a very real cost if the schedule becomes such that you're building in the winter. I think beyond that, Chuck, I think the costs that maybe get lost are not those that happen ahead of construction. Like Eric said, our job as designers, as builders, is to put together a good budget for our clients so that they have a thorough understanding of what's all going to go into the project. I think what we've seen is after the fact, with, for example, a building that's got an elevator, there's long-term operational maintenance costs associated with components like that in a building that have to be considered ahead of construction so that, once the building is up and running, that you can account for and budget for that additional operational costs year after year.
And so when people do think of those things, maybe some of those things before even the project starts, when is it that, because I think with executive directors, there's a lot of nervousness of when to engage with one of the two of you, because they're like, well, we don't necessarily have the money to start spending on this yet, but we know we do need some sort of footprint and an idea of what to do. How does that usually work in the perfect world of when people should engage with you in the process?
Well, a lot of times we'll do what we call a study, which is a very light effort that is not a complete design, but just enough. We can gather enough information and know roughly what the scope is, what their goals are, make sure we're checking the boxes and meeting their needs. And we put that into a very preliminary concept, and that gives them an idea. And with that, Katy can apply numbers, some costs. We can put together that overall project budget based on basically a napkin sketch. And sometimes they want a little idea what it's going to look like, maybe a little 3D imaging. So that can be done for very little cost, and with a small investment.
Yeah.
And I know what people are thinking when you've never been through a capital campaign before is that if you have a certain amount of land, this has nothing to do with the answer you just said, but I'm just saying this anyways, is that if you have a certain amount of land and you want to make a one-story building, a 2 or 3-story building does not necessarily equal the same cost as the 1-story building of the same square footage. Is that right to say?
I'm gonna let Katy answer that one.
Yes, Chuck, that's fair to say.
Okay, want to let people know ahead of time, so as they're trying to guess what their budgets are, they need to keep that kind of stuff in mind. So anyways, both of you have done countless number of projects with nonprofits and schools. When you think of some of the similar factors in the organizations that you worked with that have been very successful, what were some of those traits that you noticed with those organizations that were successful?
I would say that the best process are where you are able to engage the most people in a way that allows input and especially the staff and users to weigh in and therefore buy in to what the final product is. So with that, extracting the goals, the key project drivers, getting that information up front. A lot of the times the CEO has a vision, but they might not have all the information it takes to operate the facility. So getting that operational input early on is really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think the balancing act or role of the CEO in those situations is to really set the table and the expectation that, you know, this feedback is all important. All feedback is good, but all feedback may not necessarily become the project. You know, I think there's a careful nature to how you present it so that, you know, people give their feedback. They want to feel like they're part of the process. They want to feel like they're valued, and what they say is going to contribute to the end product or the building that comes. But it's a balance. You have to be careful to also then ensure, you know, so make sure that it's stated that there's a budget, there are particular goals and programming that's got to be accounted for, and really just making sure everybody is on the same page as to what their feedback means to that process. I think that's really important.
Do either of you have any final bits of advice that you would give to executive directors who are looking to do a capital campaign for the first time from a design and construction point of view?
Any questions? If you're not sure, you know, just call and ask, and ask, you know, what's the right process? What do we do next?
We ultimately see our role as problem solvers. We're here to help. We want to contribute. So questions, please, absolutely call, ask the questions. We would love to help in any way, and that doesn't necessarily mean full steam ahead. If there's questions that can be answered, we want to help be a part of that.
And if an organization wanted to see if you were the right fit for them or not, what's the best way to learn more about you?
Snapchat. I'm kidding.
Snapchat.
Obviously, we have a website. I mean, phone number. I don't know, Chuck, if you're sharing contact information or how that works, but envisionarch.com. Cardinal, I'm sure, has a website.
We do have a website.
But our contact information is on there.
Yep, same. Our contact information is on our website that we have as well. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, so different social media avenues if you want to go and really even just start by getting a feel for who we are culturally as an organization. But yeah, I would start with the website. That gives a good example of our portfolio, who we are, kind of what we're all about. And then certainly, yep, email is always a great way to go, or a phone call.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. Really appreciate it. I think a lot of the folks that are doing a capital campaign for the first time, these questions seem so basic, maybe to us because we've been through this before, but for those who never have before, this is going to be a huge help for them. So thank you for taking the time for this. To everyone else, thanks for watching. Chuck Rowe, Midwest Studies Group. Catch you next time.